It all began on a night when the Montana wind screamed loud enough to swallow a man whole. Elliot Hayes, a reclusive 45-year-old veteran, stepped into the blizzard searching for his missing cat. But what he found instead would tear open wounds he thought had healed. Chained inside an abandoned shack lay a dying German shepherd mother and 3 freezing newborn pups left with nothing but a broken collar and a mystery that made no sense. But the truth behind that chain, and the boy who put it there, will break you. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. Snow swallowed the Montana mountains in a suffocating hush, the kind that made a man feel small beneath the sky's cold indifference. Inside a lonely wooden cabin tucked against a ridgeline, Elliot Hayes warmed his stiff hands near the cast-iron stove. At 45, Elliot looked older than his years. His 6-foot frame had lost its soldier's bulk, thinning into a rangy, wiry silhouette shaped by solitude and long winters. A deep brown leather coat hung from his shoulders, scarred and cracked from years of use, and beneath it the red and navy flannel shirt carried the faint scent of smoke and pine. His dark brown hair a little too long, and brushing the nape of his neck, was streaked with silver at the temples, the only outward sign of the past he never spoke about. His face was all edges, angular cheekbones, a sharp jawline lined with scruffy stubble, and gray eyes that seemed to carry entire battlegrounds inside them. Those eyes rarely softened, except when he looked at Ryder. Ryder, the only living creature Elliot allowed into the quiet wasteland of his life, was a one-eyed tabby cat with fur the color of burnt ginger and a perpetually disgruntled expression. The missing left eye, sealed shut years before by a jagged white scar, only made him look tougher, stubborn, and incredibly loyal. Ryder was 12 years old now, and though time had stiffened his joints, he still shadowed Elliot like a grumpy guardian. The pair lived like ghosts on the mountain, sharing a silence born from wounds neither could explain. Elliot sat on the rug, letting Ryder curl against his leg, while he absently scratched the cat's chin. Outside, the wind began to rise with a sharp whistle. Elliot stiffened. The storms in Montana had a way of erasing the world, and something in the whine of that wind clawed at memories he thought he had buried. Storms were dangerous. Storms meant losing things you couldn't get back. When the first shutters clapped against the wall, Ryder's ears twitched. Another burst of wind howled louder this time. Ryder suddenly jumped from Elliot's leg, landing on the floorboards with a thud. The cat's single green eye flicked toward the door pupils, wide in alarm. Ryder, Elliot asked, straightening. The cat bolted. The heavy door, not latched properly, rattled once, then slammed open as the wind punched through the cabin. A swirl of snow and icy needles blasted inside. By the time Elliot lunged to close the door, Ryder had vanished into the storm. Panic stabbed through him with the speed of a bullet. Ryder had survived everything with him: loneliness, winter, silence, even Elliot's worst nights. But he would not survive the blizzard. Ryder, Elliot shouted voice snatched away instantly. He grabbed his fur-lined boots without lacing them, threw on his thick gray scarf, and slammed the door behind him. The storm hit him like a moving wall. Snow whipped sideways, stinging his face, clinging to his beard, freezing into the seams of his coat. He forced air into his lungs, feeling it burn like he'd inhaled knives. But fear overpowered everything. Ryder wouldn't make it far. Old joints, bad eye, terrible sense of direction. Everything about the cat made him vulnerable. Out here, Elliot's boots sank into knee-deep drifts as he pushed toward the line of pine trees behind the cabin, his body trembling from cold and adrenaline. The beam of his flashlight barely cut through the blizzard, only carving a faint yellow tunnel through the white chaos. Every step felt like dragging an anchor, but he kept going, calling Ryder's name until his throat burned raw. In the shifting whiteness, the silhouette of an old shack emerged, a hunter's outpost, abandoned long before Elliot moved here. A place Ryder might have fled to. Elliot wrestled the half-frozen door open. The hinges groaned, the smell of rot and cold metal drifting out to meet him. "Ryder!" his voice echoed. A soft, pitiful meow came from under a broken workbench. Relief hit him with such force his knees nearly buckled. Ryder crouched in the shadow, trembling violently, his fur spiked with frost. Elliot scooped him into his arms, tucking the cat under his coat. "I got you, buddy," he murmured, pressing Ryder against the flannel warmth of his chest. That was when he heard it, another sound beneath the screaming storm. A metallic drag, a low, strained whimper. Elliot's breath caught. He lifted the flashlight, its weak glow sweeping across rotted boards, broken tools, and a collapsed shelf, until it stopped on a pair of wide brown eyes staring back at him from the corner. A German shepherd lay curled against a support post, her ribs jutting like broken fence slats beneath filthy fur. She was tied by a heavy iron chain looped around her neck, the links thick enough to restrain a bear. The metal had rubbed her skin raw. Her breaths came shallow, labored, almost silent, and beneath her trembling body 3 tiny puppies, still blind, their fur damp from the cold, wriggled weakly, mewling against her belly for warmth she barely had left. Elliot froze, the sight carved straight through him. The dog lifted her head, lips quivering into a fragile snarl. It wasn't a threat, it was desperation, a dying mother trying to defend her newborns with the last of her strength. At her paws, half buried beneath snow and dirt, lay a torn leather collar with the faintly scratched name Nora. Elliot swallowed hard. Who would chain a starving mother and her puppies in a collapsing shack during a blizzard? The answer seemed obvious, cruel abandonment, but something tugged at his attention. Near the wall lay a torn canvas backpack. Elliot nudged it open with his boot. Inside were a few threadbare shirts, a cracked water bottle, and a crumpled receipt from a roadside convenience store. Paid in exact change. One item, value dog kibble, $12.50. No food for a human, only for a dog. Elliot's breath trembled. Someone had used their last dollars not on themselves, but on her. The question hit him like another gust of icy wind. Why would someone who cared spend their final money on dog food, then leave the dog chained to die? But before the thought could settle, Nora's body swayed. She let out a thin, broken sound, half whine, half surrender, and collapsed fully onto her side, eyes rolling back, breath faltering. Elliot lunged forward. "No, stay with me," he whispered the storm outside, roaring as if to drown his words. Nora's breathing hitched, once, twice, then thinned to a fragile thread. And in the dim, freezing shack, that thread threatened to snap. The blizzard clawed at the rotten walls of the shack, rattling every loose board, as if demanding entry. Elliot Hayes stood frozen in place, his breath misting sharply in the dim lantern glow. The weight of the moment pressed against his ribs, the way combat pressure once had squeezing him until each inhale felt like swallowing broken glass. But as he stared down at the collapsed German shepherd, the dying mother named Nora, and her 3 shivering newborn pups, something inside him snapped back into motion, primal and absolute. Survival, responsibility, duty. Even after all these years, the instincts of the soldier he used to be still surged to the surface. Elliot moved quickly, lowering himself beside the limp dog, despite the chain's cold bite against his fingers. His hands shook not from fear, but from the freezing wind seeping through every crack of the shack. He examined Nora more closely. Her fur, once likely thick and glowing with health, now clung to her gaunt body like a tattered blanket. Ribs pressed sharply beneath her skin, her spine curved in a malnourished arch that told a long story of starvation and struggle. Her amber-brown eyes, once fierce, had dulled to a faint glaze over sinking exhaustion. She was so light, too light for a shepherd her size. He lifted her carefully, and the truth hit him with brutal clarity. She was little more than skin stretched over bone. Beside her, the puppies wriggled blindly, their bodies barely larger than Elliot's palms. Their fur was still damp from birth, tiny legs kicking weakly as they cried for warmth their mother no longer had to give. "Hang on, girl," Elliot muttered under his breath, voice hoarse. "You're not dying here." His words were more than determination. They were a command. Something he used to shout over gunfire and chaos. Something he once told a dying brother in arms. And the memory of that moment, hands slick with blood dust choking his lungs, a young soldier's terrified eyes staring up at him, flashed like lightning behind his eyes. Elliot grit his teeth and forced the memory back down, pushing himself into the present. He reached for the bolt cutters he had grabbed from the cabin earlier, heavy and cold metal biting into his gloved grip. Positioning them around the thickest link of the chain near Nora's neck, he leaned his full weight onto the handles. His muscles strained beneath his battered flannel shirt and worn leather jacket. The chain resisted, groaning under the pressure. Elliot's breath steamed harshly against the cold air as he pushed harder. With a sharp metallic crack, the chain snapped apart. Nora flinched at the sound, but she did not lift her head. She didn't have the strength. "You're free," Elliot whispered, not sure whether he was speaking to Nora or to a piece of himself he hadn't realized was still chained. Working with urgency, he pulled open his heavy leather jacket and peeled back the inner flannel layer. He gathered the 3 puppies, gently cupping them, as though holding fragile embers that might go out at any moment. Their tiny bodies twitched at the sudden shift in temperature. Elliot pressed them against his chest, tucking them inside his flannel shirt, burying them against his own heat. Their cries softened slightly. His body would be their furnace. He could feel the vibration of their faint heartbeats against his ribs. Then he turned back to Nora. Even half-conscious, she let out a faint, instinctive rumble, the last shreds of her maternal warning. "Easy," Elliot murmured. "I'm taking you home." He slid his arms beneath her, feeling every ridge of bone, every tremor of pain. Her head lolled weakly against his forearm. She weighed far less than a shepherd should, far less than some soldier's packs he once carried across desert terrain. He rose to his feet, slowly, legs bracing themselves, and maneuvered her toward the sled he had dragged behind him. The sled was old, built from oak planks, with steel runners dulled by years of friction, originally meant for hauling firewood. Tonight it would save a life. He laid Nora onto the wool blanket lining the sled and tucked another blanket over her body. She made a soft sound, half whine, half breath, barely audible over the storm's howl. Elliot secured the puppies tighter against his chest and took hold of the sled's braided rope, looping it around his waist to distribute the weight. The moment he stepped out of the shack, the blizzard struck him like a living force. Snow whipped sideways, coating his hair, freezing his beard, cutting across his cheeks like tiny blades. The temperature felt as though it plunged past 30 below. His scarf whipped violently against his shoulder as he leaned forward, planting his boots deep into the snow and dragging the sled from the shelter. The cold bit through every layer he wore, sinking into bone and muscle. The flannel shirt clung wetly to his chest from melted snow and the body heat of the puppies. Each breath felt like inhaling shards of ice. Elliot's mind narrowed to a single tunnel: left foot, right foot, don't stop. The storm roared louder, as if it sensed weakness. Twice he stumbled, once catching his shin on a buried branch, another time when the sled snagged on a hidden stump, nearly jerking him backward. His knees buckled, but he refused to fall. Not with 3 newborns pressed against his heart. Not with a dying mother on the sled. He pressed on, muscles burning, breath ragged. The cabin's faint silhouette finally emerged from the white void like a dark, wavering beacon. By the time he reached the porch, every inch of him ached. His hands no longer felt like hands, just numb extensions of willpower. Kicking the door open, he dragged the sled into the mudroom, sealing out the wind behind him. Inside, the cabin's warmth hit him like a hammer. Ryder recovered enough to stand, stared with wide, round eye as Elliot untied the rope and freed the puppies from his jacket, placing them near the stove in a makeshift nest of blankets. He rushed back to Nora, lifting her gently and carrying her closer to the fire. Her breaths came in shallow pulses, her body trembling faintly. Elliot grabbed his old emergency kit, IV fluids, left over from livestock supplies, antiseptic dropper bottles. He didn't hesitate. He inserted a small needle under her skin, starting a slow, warm drip of fluids. He cleaned the wounds on her neck with a shaking but controlled hand. The puppies began to whimper from the cold, so he warmed goat milk over the stove, just as he remembered farmers doing when he was a boy. One by one he fed them, drop by precious drop. Their tiny tongues flicked weakly at the milk, then more eagerly. Life, fragile but persistent, flickered inside them. And as Elliot worked, Nora let out a faint, instinctive growl, not a threat, but a memory echoing through her pain. The sound struck straight through Elliot's chest, dragging up the ghosts of nights, when he knelt beside young soldiers bleeding out in sand and fire. He had heard that same sound then, a breath on the edge of oblivion. It twisted something deep inside him. Not again, he thought fiercely. Not this time. He stabilized Nora's head with his hand, feeling the fragile thrum of her pulse beneath her jaw. "Stay with them," he whispered. "Stay with me." Her chest rose weakly, fell, rose again. Elliot stayed by her side, willing her to hold on, refusing to let another life slip through his fingers. The storm eased by morning, leaving the Montana forest drowned beneath a dull, heavy sky that sagged with leftover snow. The world outside Elliot Hayes's cabin felt muted, as if sound itself had been frozen overnight. Inside, the air smelled of wood smoke, warm flannel, and the faint sweetness of goat milk simmered on the stove. Elliot hadn't slept. Dark bruises circled his gray eyes, etched deep against the sharp planes of his face. He sat beside Nora, who lay wrapped in 2 thick blankets, her chest rising and falling in fragile, uneven waves. The puppies slept in a wooden crate he had lined with towels, their tiny bodies twitching occasionally as they dreamed of warmth. Ryder perched on a nearby chair tail, wrapped stiffly around his paws, the single green eye watching every movement as if guarding both Elliot and the fragile family he had dragged home. Elliot's mind refused to quiet. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of the night before the broken chain digging into Nora's neck, the collapsed shack, the torn backpack, the receipt for dog food paid in coins. Something didn't add up. Cruelty left teeth marks. It left recklessness, rage, indifference. But the scene he found wasn't cruelty. It was desperation. He rubbed a hand across his stubbled jaw, the rough scrape grounding him. He needed answers, and answers meant going back. By the time Sheriff Blake Carter arrived, the morning was already biting cold. Sheriff Carter was a man built like a mountain stump, broad, steady, and carved from years of small-town hardship. He was in his late 50s, skin weathered like old leather with silver-gray hair cropped short. Deep lines formed around his eyes, not from laughter, but from investigating too many tragedies in a county that pretended to be peaceful. His voice when he spoke carried a calm weight. "Got your message, Elliot? Said you found something?" Elliot nodded, grabbing his thick brown leather coat and pulling his gray scarf tighter around his neck. Found more than something, he muttered. I think someone tried to save her. Sheriff Carter arched an eyebrow. Save who? Nora Elliot said. The German shepherd. The sheriff followed Elliot to the sled outside, now empty, but still stained with melted snow and flecks of Nora's fur. He studied it for a long moment before nodding slowly. Lead the way. The walk to the abandoned shack was quicker in daylight, but colder. Snow crunched beneath their boots, the trees looming like pale sentinels. Elliot's muscles ached from exhaustion, but adrenaline pushed him forward. He kept replaying the same question: who would sacrifice their last money for dog food, and then leave a dog chained to die? The shack appeared like a ghost from the trees, crooked, sunken, defeated. Sheriff Carter ducked inside with Elliot. The smell of rot and cold metal lingered heavy in the air. Elliot pointed to where Nora had been chained, the broken link glinting faintly beneath the wan light seeping through the cracks. There, Elliot said. Carter crouched beside the post, fingers brushing over the splintered wood and bent chain. This wasn't cut by accident. Somebody tried to secure her. Tight. His gaze drifted toward the discarded backpack. Elliot lifted it and handed it over. The sheriff rummaged through it, eyebrows narrowing when he found the tattered receipt. No food for the owner, Carter murmured. Only for the dog. Elliot nodded stiffly. That's what I thought. Something else caught the sheriff's eye, a cracked old smartphone buried beneath a scrap of cloth inside the pack. Well now, he muttered, turning it over in his hands. Let's see what secrets you're hiding. The screen was shattered, spiderwebbed across the surface, but the device still flickered to life when Carter held down the power button. Elliot leaned closer. His breath held. The battery was nearly dead, but just enough for one final gasp of information. The phone opened to a notes app. A single unsent message waited. Sheriff Carter tapped it. The words appeared trembling on the fading screen. My name is Jacob Miller. I fell and broke my leg. I can't walk. I chained Nora so she wouldn't follow me into the storm. Please save her. She's all I have. I'm trying to find a signal. Please, help her. Elliot froze. Jacob Miller. The name hit him with the force of a blow. Sheriff Carter's jaw tightened, his voice low. That explains the dog food. He spent everything on her. Elliot swallowed hard, throat burning. How long ago do you think he wrote that? Sheriff Carter shook his head. Not long. But if he was crawling through this storm with a broken leg... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Elliot felt the answer like ice in his veins. They stepped outside, scanning the snow-blanketed ground. It didn't take long. A set of faint drag marks, human drag marks, trailed away from the shack toward a narrow ridge. Not footprints. Handprints. Knees. Someone had pulled themselves through the blizzard. He crawled, Elliot whispered, voice cracking. He crawled for help. Sheriff Carter followed the trail a few dozen yards before stopping abruptly. There, half buried beneath a drift of snow, lay a frozen shape. The sheriff knelt, brushing snow gently away. Jacob Miller appeared inch by inch, a young man no older than 24, thin to the point of frailty, with messy brown hair stiffened by frost. His skin was pale blue lips, cracked fingers raw from dragging himself across ice. His face was peaceful in a heartbreaking way, as if he had died mid-breath. Elliot stepped closer, chest tight. The sheriff spoke softly. Looks like he collapsed right before the ridge. A few more yards past that. Elliot finished the sentence in a whisper. He would have had signal. Silence fell over the forest, not cold, but crushing. Elliot felt something deep inside him fracture. He stared at Jacob's frozen face, imagining the last moments, the pain and the fear, the hope that someone would save Nora. A boy with nothing, no family, no money, no home, had fought the storm with a broken leg crawling through hell, not for himself, but for his dog. And Elliot had spent the night cursing whoever chained Nora. Shame surged through him, twisting with awe and grief, until he could barely breathe. Snow settled quietly on Jacob's still body. Elliot's voice was barely more than air. He died trying to save her. Sheriff Carter placed a gentle hand on Elliot's shoulder. Most people don't go this far for anything. That boy, he loved her. Elliot closed his eyes. The bitterness and anger he carried from the night before drained out of him, replaced by something heavier and more painful, respect so deep it hurt. I blamed him, Elliot whispered. I thought someone had abandoned her, but he did everything he could. Sheriff Carter nodded once. You're not the first to judge too quickly, but you can choose what you do with the truth now. Elliot looked at Jacob, then at the trail the young man had made through impossible cold. His throat tightened. In that moment, the world shifted. Curses turned into sorrow, anger turned into reverence, and Elliot Hayes, a man who thought he had no heart left to break, felt something inside him crumble quietly and completely. Morning light crept gently across the Montana forest, turning the snow into a soft, shimmering blanket that glowed pale blue beneath the winter sun. The cold still held its bite, but the air felt calmer than the violent nights that came before. Elliot Hayes stood in the clearing behind his cabin, his breath drifting upward like thin smoke as he faced the old white oak tree. The tree towered above the landscape roots, twisting deep like veins of the earth itself. It was the oldest living thing for miles, a silent witness to countless winters and storms, just as Elliot had become a witness to too many endings. A freshly dug grave rested beneath its wide branches, the soil dark and moist against the snow. Jacob Miller lay there now, wrapped in the thick wool blanket Elliot had taken from his own bed. Elliot pressed his gloved hand against the mound of earth, bowing his head. He wasn't a man of prayer, not anymore, but grief had a way of forcing reverence into even the most broken souls. You did everything you could, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. More than most men twice your age. The wind moved through the oak's branches with a low sighing sound, as though the tree itself was answering. Elliot stood silently for a long time, wrestling with the heavy ache in his chest. The guilt he carried from the battlefield, those he couldn't save, the young lives lost in his arms, had weighed on him for years. But this was different. This boy had fought the storm alone, crawling through hell on a broken leg for the sake of a single dog. Elliot felt humbled in a way he couldn't describe, as though Jacob's quiet courage had exposed the hollow parts inside him. After a moment, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the cracked collar he had found beside Nora. The metal ring jingled softly as he brushed snow from its faded leather. He hung it gently on a low branch of the oak, letting it sway in the cold wind. She's safe now, he murmured. I'll make sure she always is. When he turned back towards the cabin, his boots crunching in the snow, something small thudded against his leg. Ryder, his old one-eyed tabby, had followed him out, tail stiffened by the cold, but determination in every step. Elliot scooped the cat into his arms for warmth and trudged toward home. Inside the cabin, the crackling stove cast a warm glow across the wooden floor. Nora lifted her head when Elliot entered. The German Shepherd mother looked stronger now. Her ribs still showed, but her eyes had regained their depth, a warm, quiet intelligence that reminded Elliot of Jacob's message. He knelt beside her and said softly, "Nora." At the sound of her name, she rose shakily to her paws and stepped forward, her tail lowering in a hesitant wag. She pressed her muzzle gently against Elliot's knee. He froze, not out of fear, but out of the overwhelming realization that Jacob Miller had loved her with everything he had, and now she was choosing Elliot. "You're home," Elliot whispered. Nora leaned her head into his hand, as though agreeing. The puppies, now several weeks old, were already tumbling around the cabin in rowdy bursts of energy. Each had developed a clear personality. Max, the largest, had a sturdy build and fearless attitude, often barreling head-first into furniture, as though the world were a playground waiting to be conquered. His thick, black and tan fur and confident stance made him look like a future working dog. Lily, the smallest, was gentle and quiet, a soft-faced pup, with delicate paws and warm brown eyes that watched everything with cautious curiosity. She preferred lying on blankets or retreating behind Nora when the world grew too loud. Scout was the middle pup, lean, bright-eyed, already sensitive to every sound and movement. He had the watchfulness of a protector, often climbing onto Elliot's lap to check his breathing or licking his hands whenever Elliot sat too still. Elliot had grown attached to all of them, but he knew what was right. As the weeks passed and winter softened slightly, he began searching for homes worthy of them. A young farming couple from 2 valleys over Emily and Carter Reed, both in their early 30s, came first. Emily had warm auburn hair and freckles scattered across her cheeks, while Carter was broad-shouldered with kind blue eyes and a laugh that filled the room. They had lost a dog to illness the previous year and had been hesitant to adopt again, but the moment Max barreled into Carter's knees, barking with fearless delight, their hesitation melted instantly. "He's perfect," Emily breathed, rubbing the pup's ears. "He's exactly what our farm needs." Max went home with them that afternoon, riding proudly in the back seat of their pickup. Lily was next. She found a home with Margaret Holt, a widowed 60-year-old woman who lived alone near the river. Margaret was short and thin, with silver hair always tied in a loose bun and soft wrinkles framing her gentle smile. "I could use the company," she admitted in a quiet voice, stroking Lily's head as if she were holding something precious. Lily burrowed into the woman's coat, immediately trembling with trust. Scout, the watchful middle pup, was adopted by Caleb Dawson, a firefighter in his late 20s, who visited the cabin after hearing about the rescue from Sheriff Carter. Caleb had sandy blonde hair, soot-scarred hands, and steady green eyes that spoke of someone who had seen both flames and fear up close. "This one would make a great therapy dog," Caleb said, kneeling to let Scout sniff him. "We've got veterans with PTSD at the station who could use a friend like him." Scout licked his chin in agreement. One by one, Elliot watched the pups leave, proud, hopeful, and a little heartbroken. The cabin felt quieter afterward, but not empty. Nora remained by his side, her presence a warm shadow that followed him through every room. She slept at the foot of his bed, padded after him during chores, and occasionally nudged Ryder aside when she wanted attention of her own. Elliot found comfort in her loyalty, comfort he had not expected to feel again. When he walked through the forest, Nora walked beside him. When he chopped wood, she lay nearby, keeping watch. When nightmares pulled him awake in the middle of the night, she lifted her head and pressed her nose to his arm, grounding him back in the present. She became a part of him, his silent companion, his link to Jacob, his reminder that love could climb out of the darkest storms. And as the days stretched on, Nora's eyes followed Elliot with a trust so deep and steady that he understood Jacob's final words in the unsent message more than ever. She wasn't just a dog. She was family. And Elliot Hayes, who once believed he was too broken to belong anywhere, had finally found something worth holding on to again. Snow drifted softly over the Montana Valley, falling in slow, deliberate flakes that turned the world into a muted watercolor of white and silver. The storms of years past had once roared like beasts, but now winter arrived quietly, as though it too had grown old. Elliot Hayes stood on the porch of his wooden cabin, leaning slightly on the railing, his breath forming small clouds in the cold morning air. Time had added new weight to his frame, not in the form of fat, but in the thinning of muscle and the heaviness in his joints. His once dark brown hair, long enough to brush his collar, now shimmered with streaks of silver that caught the wind like fine threads of frost. The rugged lines carved into his angular face were deeper than before, the kind made not by age alone, but by a lifetime of carrying memories heavier than any winter load. He wore the same dark brown leather coat that had become a second skin, though the creases in it were sharper now, and the red and navy flannel beneath it showed frayed edges at the cuffs. Standing beside him on an orthopedic dog bed laid near the warm cabin wall was Nora. The German shepherd mother who had once survived a blizzard with nothing but instinct and sheer will now lifted her head only with effort. Her muzzle, once a rich mix of tan and black, had turned almost entirely white, giving her the solemn appearance of a wise elder. Her amber eyes had grown cloudy, though their warmth had never faded. Her breathing was shallow, a delicate rise and fall that tugged at Elliot's chest every time he looked at her. Ryder Elliot's old cat had passed years earlier, and the cabin had felt emptier since. Only Nora remained the last living thread tied to Jacob Miller, the boy who had loved her enough to die for her. Elliot knelt down beside Nora, wincing as his aging knees protested. She watched him with slow, patient eyes, her ears flicking faintly as he stroked the fur along her cheek. "Easy, girl," he whispered. "I'm right here." Winter sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm square of golden light over Nora's paws. The flames in the stove behind them crackled softly. Elliot lay down on the rug, stretching out beside her, as he had done every night for the last few weeks. He took her paw gently into his hand, running his thumb over the rough pads that had once carried her through snowdrifts almost as high as her chest. Her paw twitched perhaps at the memory of running. Elliot's heart tightened. "You don't have to hold on anymore," he murmured, his voice cracked, barely audible. "You've done enough, Nora. Jacob's waiting for you." Her cloudy eyes shifted toward him, searching his face with a kind of tired gratitude. She exhaled softly, a long, trembling breath that fluttered like a candle nearing its end. Elliot pressed his forehead gently to hers, closing his eyes. "Go on, girl," he whispered, a tear slipping down the side of his nose. "I'll be okay." In the warm glow of the fire, with Elliot's hand still wrapped around her paw, Nora's chest lifted one more time, then fell for the last. Elliot didn't move. He stayed there for nearly an hour, holding her, listening to the quiet, letting the stillness settle. When he finally rose, his face was pale, lined with grief, but steady. He wrapped Nora carefully in a wool blanket, the same one she used to curl on during cold nights, and carried her in his arms out into the snowfall. The walk to the oak tree felt longer than it had ever been. Beneath its ancient branches lay Jacob's grave, marked by a simple cedar cross. Elliot dug beside it through frozen earth, working slowly but with purpose. Each movement was an act of honoring, an act of farewell. When the grave was ready, Elliot lowered Nora into the earth and rested a hand on her blanket-wrapped form. "Back where you belong," he whispered, his voice trembling. "With him." He filled the grave and stood there as the snow settled over the fresh mound, like a soft white shroud. The valley was silent, except for the distant echo of wind winding through the pines. That night the cabin felt painfully empty. Elliot sat in his rocking chair, staring at the fire, as shadows danced on the walls. The ghost of Jacob seemed to linger by the door, and the memory of Nora's warmth still pressed against his leg. "It never ends, does it?" he whispered to the empty room. "Losing the ones you love." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. The emptiness wasn't the end. It was a pause, a doorway half open waiting for the next step. Weeks passed. The ache softened but never disappeared. Elliot continued his days with a quiet resolve, splitting firewood, fixing fences, maintaining the cabin. One morning after a night of restless dreams, he made a decision. He put on his leather coat, wrapped his gray scarf around his neck, and drove down the mountain road into town. The dog shelter sat at the edge of Oak Haven, a simple concrete building run by a small team of volunteers. The lobby smelled faintly of disinfectant and warm fur. A young woman with short, curly black hair, dark brown skin, and bright, empathetic eyes looked up from the desk. Her name tag read, Sarah Coleman. "Morning, sir," she greeted gently. Sarah was in her early 30s, tall and slender, with an aura of patient kindness that made nervous animals instinctively calm around her. "Are you looking to adopt Elliot?" nodded, clearing his throat. "Yeah. Someone older, if you've got one. Someone who needs a place to land." Sarah smiled softly, understanding the unspoken grief behind his voice. "I think I know just who to show you." She led him down the row of kennels. Young dogs barked, tails wagging against the metal bars. But Sarah walked all the way to the final kennel at the end, quiet, dimly lit. A large German shepherd mix lay curled on a thin cot, his fur a patchwork of rusty red and gray, as though time had brushed him with both fire and ash. His ears were mismatched, one stood erect, the other drooped halfway. His eyes, warm but clouded with age, lifted slowly toward Elliot. The dog's gaze was weary but hopeful. He did not bark. He simply thumped his tail, once tentative, as if asking for permission to hope. "This is Rusty," Sarah said softly. 10 years old, arthritis in the hips. Owner surrendered him when they moved. He's gentle, a little lonely." Elliot knelt before the kennel. Rusty sniffed his hand, then licked his fingers with a slow, grateful swipe. Something inside Elliot cracked open, not pain this time, but recognition. Two old souls, both carrying winters of their own. "Yeah," Elliot whispered. "I know the feeling." Sarah opened the kennel door. Rusty rose stiffly, leaning into Elliot's touch, as though anchoring himself. Elliot slipped his arms beneath the dog and lifted him with a soft grunt. Rusty rested his head on Elliot's shoulder with surprising trust for a creature long abandoned. As they walked to the car, Rusty's weight felt right, familiar, like the universe was gently guiding Elliot forward one more time. Elliot settled Rusty onto the passenger seat, tucking a blanket around his paws. Before closing the door, he paused, brushing a hand over the dog's graying fur. "Let's go home, old friend," he murmured. Rusty gave a soft rumble of contentment, his tail tapping once against the seat. And with that, Elliot Hayes climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The truck rolled forward through the snow, carrying two weathered hearts toward the quiet, open gate of whatever came next. In the quiet rhythm of everyday life, we often overlook the small miracles God places in our path, acts of loyalty, moments of compassion, the courage to begin again. Elliot Nora. Jacob and Rusty remind us that love is never lost. It simply finds new hands to hold. If this story touched your heart, please share it so others may feel its warmth. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of hope and redemption. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your spirit through every storm. Amen.